This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Ahoy, folks. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Let me just jump in here. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to James from Philadelphia. In my book, Determined, I make reference to William Henry Harrison, 9th President of the United States, who caught pneumonia and died 31 days after he was inaugurated in 1841. He actually was not inaugurated in January. What James has pointed out was he was instead inaugurated in March, which was done at the time. And that's actually relevant because the folk wisdom is in January, he gave his presidential inaugural address, went on for so long that he caught pneumonia and died 31 days later, catching it instead at his inauguration in March. Best evidence is that instead he died of dysentery. So thank you, James.
All right. For our first question, Mark from New Jersey, Michael from England, and a few others have asked if you could please talk about acquired savant syndrome.
Fantastically interesting syndrome. Right off the bat, we've got to dichotomize between savant syndrome and acquired savant syndrome. Savant syndrome, think of the Raymond character in Rain Man, who amid some rather pronounced intellectual impairments had unbelievable mathematical gifts where he could calculate what day of the week some date was while Henry VII was king, and where you have a pocket of astonishingly good cognition, cognitive functioning, amid a backdrop of a fair amount of impairment. Now, the textbook case that always gets brought up was this guy named Kim Peek, who was born 1951. He lived to his late 50s or so. He was a very rare neurologically troubled individual in that he was macrocephalic. He was born with a brain with more neurons than normal. In addition, the corpus callosum, the bunch of fibers that connected his two hemispheres, didn't exist in him. And he had all these cognitive problems, and throughout his life, he was never able to dress himself. He was never able to brush his teeth, all sorts of impairments. Yet, he had all sorts of these savant qualities. You would say to him, Kim, April 6th, 1833, how many days old was William Henry Harrison? And he would instantly have the answer. Calendar calculating. In addition, he had a photographic memory, and get this, having something to do with his two hemispheres not really being connected. He could read a book, he could read both pages at the same time with a photographic memory, and he knew word for word 12,000 different books. He knew note for note every score for every symphony out there, sufficiently so that he could sit there listening to it and say, the trombone was a half step off. And no indication that it sounded discordant to him. He simply was able to recognize the tones, and he had the entire score memorized. He knew the zip code of every. You would say to him, Kim, Eden Prairie, Minnesota, what's the zip code? Good, what's the area code? What's the street map? What's the main street? What if you wanted to get from City Hall to the biggest church in town? And he had a spatial map of all the. This is savant syndrome. Acquired savant syndrome, in contrast, is where you have somebody who's pretty average cognitively and they get a brain injury. They have a stroke, they have a concussive head trauma, they develop dementia, and amid all sorts of intellectual impairments afterward, typically, suddenly, they're unbelievably good at something, like otherworldly good in the realm of stuff we were seeing with Kim Peek. The savant syndrome people, they tend to be astonishingly good at math, at artistry, at music, a few other areas. And with these acquired savant syndrome people, you see the same exact thing. Some examples, a guy named Orlando Sorrell, who at age 10 had a concussive head injury, a pretty serious one. And in the aftermath, he had no prior interest in math, no particular ability in it. Within a week or two, he could do calendar calculations. You give him a date and a location anywhere in the last century or whatever, and he can tell you what the weather was that day, because all of that stuff had just gotten in there within a few weeks of his injury and no prior evidence of being at all interested in math or decent at it. Then there was this guy, Jason Paget, who as a 20-year-old, he was a petty criminal. This is what he looked like. And I'm willing to admit some biases that guys in bad muscle shirts and bad mullets I would not necessarily want to hang out with. And in that stage, he was coming out of a bar one evening and got jumped by two guys who beat him senseless and caused rather extensive brain damage. And in the weeks afterward, he developed obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, that's interesting. He developed a complete obsession with geometry, separate of becoming a savant with calendar calculations, separate of suddenly developing synesthesia, where every sensation was sensed with all 5 sensory modalities. He became obsessed with geometry, and his brain processing changed so that he would look at figures, at objects, and see them as the geometric objects that made them up. He would see somebody walking, and he would see each instant of walking as a frozen frame and the geometric objects that made up that person walking. This was like Riemann sums in the 4th dimension or something, and no prior anything whatsoever. He was basically like a criminal hoodlum. What he also became obsessed with was drawing fine pen or pencil geometric objects. And you could see some examples of his there in the aftermath of a head injury. Next person, someone named Derek Amato, who dived into a pool one day and dived too enthusiastically into the shallow end or the jacuzzi or something and smashed his head into the bottom of the pool. Concussive brain injury, 4 days worth of headaches, dizziness, disorientation. And then suddenly on day 5, he became obsessed with music and obsessed with mathematical aspects of music, counterpoint theory, harmony. He started composing stuff obsessively. More and more cases like this. The person who was probably most studied was the guy named Tommy McHugh, a Brit, who once again had a criminal history, petty thief, and some low-grade violence. And this is the most interesting case of acquired savant syndrome in terms of how it happened. He was in a bar. He was in the bathroom. He was sitting on the toilet. Somebody banged on the door and said, "Get out of there already. I need to use the bathroom." So he squeezed really hard and ruptured 2 blood vessels in his brain. He had a massive bilateral hemorrhage. And by the next day, he was obsessed with painting. He spent the rest of his life virtually doing nothing but painting 20 hours a day. And as you can see here, he painted every wall of his apartment. He painted the ceiling. He painted the floor. His style was some sort of cross between, I don't know, Peter Max and Edvard Munch. And after a while, they like pried off his ceiling and stuck it in galleries. These are documented cases. These are very well understood cases where people showed not the slightest skills in these areas beforehand. It's fascinating that suddenly they can calculate weather from 4 centuries ago. These amazing cognitive savant-y things they were suddenly able to do. For my money, even more interesting was the obsessiveness with which these people fell into it. All things considered, Tommy McHugh, his paintings were good, but he was not an amazing artist. But what was most interesting was his obsessive need for doing this 20 hours a day. The obsessive need for Jason Paget to sit hours and hours each day drawing complex geometrical patterns. So that brings up 2 things. What's the neurobiology of the obsession? What's the neurobiology of suddenly being really good at something? Could it be that they got really good at something because they were doing it 20 hours a day? No, people who, for example, after a head injury, suddenly do calendar calculation, suddenly can do it. The day after, 4 days after, a rapid transition in those cases. And as you might guess, this is incredibly rare. Depending on who you read, less than 50 cases have been documented. And of course, what we get to now is what's the mechanism? What goes on in the brain after a certain type of injury? And naturally, what you could guess is nobody has a clue at this point, but there's two plausible types of explanations. The first one is really dependent on the folks who become acquired savants over the weeks to months after their injury. And what that is thought to be about is after an injury, your brain undergoes neuroplasticity. Neurons grow new processes to try to compensate for the neurons that were killed. There's rewiring in the brain. And every now and then, it rewires in a way where this person now comes out and can tell you what day of the week it was during, the Roman Empire or something. Just rewiring in this completely fluky way. So that's a neuroplasticity argument. The other one is what people call paradoxical functional facilitation, which the idea is that skill has been in there the whole time, lurking underneath the surface, inhibited, and something about this particular version of damage knocks out the thing that's been inhibiting it, and suddenly it comes out the other end, and you have this latent skill that's been lurking there all along. Brain imaging studies give you virtually zero ability to distinguish between those two models, but they seem to be the leading ones. The main thing that comes out of the acquired savant literature is it tends to be injuries to the left hemisphere more than the right, and overall, this is for real. What are the odds of somebody getting a concussive head injury so that in the aftermath, they can suddenly do geometry like nobody on earth? This seems so unlikely. One important number at the end, worldwide, there are approximately 70 million concussive head traumas a year. That's an awful lot of different outcomes. And if 1 out of 70 million every decade or so, this pops out the other end, this seems to be for real.
Now, Tejas from India asks, why didn't any other primate evolve to be the centerpiece of life on Earth? Was evolution biased for Homo sapiens?
First off, one has to ask, are we the centerpiece of life on Earth? We seem pretty convinced of that in our arrogance. There's all sorts of other species out there that may lay claim to being the most central form of life on the planet. For example, I don't know, Ebola virus may very well prove to be the hardiest thing out there. In terms of sheer biomass, for every pound of human being on this planet, there's 2 pounds of krill. There's 1,200 pounds of bacteria, which sounds pretty weird. And the weirdest thing is I found this looking up at the World Economic Forum. So maybe we're really not the center of the world all that often, but to the extent that we are central enough that we're driving gazillions of other species into extinction, what's the deal with humans? Why did we wind up being such a dominant species on this planet? And the answer basically is that we're generalists. There's very little about us as a species, as a primate, that we really specialize in. Okay, take, for example, digestion. Let's look at what most primate digestive specialization is like. You get gelada baboons, and all they eat are seeds and grass. You get eyes, which are these totally weird prosimian things. And here's what they do. They have one incredibly elongated finger, which they use at night to tap on wood to hear insects moving around in there. And at that point, they pull the wood open and pull out the insect. That's their entire diet. Marmosets live predominantly off of tree sap and nectar. Gorillas. Gorillas, they're eating stems and shoots and leaves, and that's about it. These are very, very specialized diets. And what that means is you have to live in very narrow, specialized habitats. But then there's us. There's stuff we can't digest, like cellulose, but overall, we've got the widest diet by far of any organism out there, any mammal, any primate. We eat all kinds of stuff. The question immediately being, why are we able to do that? One big part of it is very human stuff we've come up with over the vast amounts of time. Fire. We cook food and we have tools for cutting up meat, and suddenly you can eat, digest all sorts of stuff that wouldn't be possible for your run-of-the-mill primate. What else? The nuts and bolts of our digestive systems suggest we don't just specialize in shoots or leaves. We are very, very broad enzymes that break down nutrients in your diet. Now, one of the rules of enzymes is they have a very narrow range in which they work best, a range of pH. Get a little too acidic, a little too alkaline, and they lose 90% of their activity. Digestive enzymes in us have these big, wide distributions for digesting all sorts of things. We've got digestive enzymes that you don't find in most other primates. Amylase. What does that do? That digests breakfast cereal for us, starch. Moreover, depending on which human population you live in, the number of copies of the gene for amylase will vary. Are you a rice-growing population, or are you mostly hunter-gatherers? So that's a feature of it. Then, amid our incredible diversity, we've got pretty diverse gut microbiomes. And you don't see it when it's somebody who's watching this, but you go to indigenous human populations that are not living off of processed food, and you see some of the highest levels, variety of different species of microbes in the stomach, because they're eating every possible thing. And what's a critical thing that comes out of that? Very diverse diets with very diverse digestive enzymes and very diverse gut microbiomes means you can live in very diverse places. There's no other species on Earth that lives in desert and rainforest and tundra. We're not as good with cold as polar bears are. We're not as good with heat as camels are, but we're pretty good at all of them. We're generalists. You see this in another realm, human sexual behavior. And this is something we've talked about in the past. You can broadly break social species into those that pair bond monogamously for life versus ones that are polygamous, ones that are polyandrous. You've got pair bonded species, you've got tournament species, and you could take one look at a primate no one has ever seen before. And if you know what to look for, you can tell what their sexual behavior patterns are until you get to us. And as we've talked about in the past, we are not a classic pair bonding species. We are not a classic tournament species, as these polygamous ones are called. We're about halfway in between, genetically, anatomically, in terms of brain wiring, in terms of hormones. We're about halfway in between, and one individual to the next varies a whole lot as to which extreme they're at. And what do? You get things like every traditional society on Earth allows polygamy. But amid them allowing polygamy, most men have a single wife. However, economic component, in most of those cultures, if the guy had more money, he would go get a second, third, or 40th wife. We've got like crazily complex, generalized reproductive strategies. We don't specialize in one single one. Social structures, you get some primate species, you get Hamadryas baboons. They live with the social structure where you've got a male with a harem, a small number of females, and there's another harem, and there's a whole bunch of them, which collectively form a band. And you take a baby Hamadryas baboon and drop him into a population of olive baboons, related species, but with a completely different social structure. And you will soon see this young male, as he's growing up, this hamadryas, is trying to herd the females into joining his harem. They've got that structure wired into them. Hyenas, female social dominance. As was studied at Berkeley some years ago, you take hyenas just as pups from the wild and raise them in a group. They got no adults to look at, seeing that the females are dominant, the females are more aggressive. But after a little practice, they wound up with the exact same system on their own. Elephants, they're run by matriarchs. And what do we have? We've got social systems with harems, and we've got social systems with female dominance and matriarchies and patriarchies, and we are not specialists when it comes to our social systems. Again and again, we are generalists. Now, another way of saying this is there's all sorts of stuff we're okay at. There's nothing we're really, really good at. We do not have some amazing, amazing attributes where we could do it better than any other species out there, but we could do more things half-assed than any other species out there. And you can see this vision, acuity of vision. We're nowhere in the top 100 in terms of acuity. Best ones out there are eagles and falcons and all sorts of raptors like that. In terms of the gradations of color that you could see with vision, moths and bats and all sorts of other species leave us in the dust. At the same time, we can see a whole lot better than armadillos can, or what else? Mantis shrimps or naked mole rats, mostly because they live in the dark. So we're okay at vision. We're probably better than average, but not amazing at it. At the same time, we're probably better than average with hearing, but we are not super duper hearing organisms. The species out there that run incredible circles around us, moths, bats with their sonar, elephants have amazing hearing. If you define hearing as being able to pick up vibrations, elephants can pick up footsteps of other elephants from miles away by the vibration in the ground. They have mechanoreceptive cells, neurons in the bottom of their feet that could pick up who just started walking a mile away. Incredible stuff like that. Hearing dogs, obviously dogs are great at that, and we're not very good at it, but at the same time, we're better than anteaters. We're better than squid at hearing. We're better than tunas. We're better than naked mole rats. Naked mole rats are almost deaf. They live their entire lives in these underground tunnels, and there's so many naked mole rats squeaking in there that they've had to evolve partial deafness, or else it would just be so thunderously loud in the corridors there. So we're not the worst hearers out there. We're nowhere near the best. We're somewhere in the middle. Same thing with smell. We are not like rats. We're not like dogs. We're not like elephants, bloodhounds, any of those, but we're better than a whole lot of other species. How about physical attributes? Fastest human out there can run way, way faster than a sloth. Fastest time ever clocked for a sprint, Usain Bolt, just short of 28 miles an hour. And whoa, and then you look and there's cheetah that runs 70 miles an hour. There's sailfish that could swim at 70. There's bats and various raptor birds, which when they're diving after a prey, easily break 200 miles an hour. We're not the strongest species out there. We don't have the most endurance. And that one's interesting because one of the things that humans tend to brag about is, we're not as strong as ants per body weight. We're not as powerful with this. We don't have the muscle strength of chimps, but we have endurance walking. And if you're in a traditional human culture of hunter-gatherers, one of the most effective hunting techniques out there is to walk your prey to death. You get out on the edge of a field and there's a giraffe there which sees you and freaks out and runs to the next field. and you walk over to the next field, and the giraffe freaks out and runs to the next one, and you do this over and over and over, and eventually, because giraffe can't dissipate heat the way we can, they can't handle lactic acidosis in their muscles, we can walk them to death. They eventually collapse from exhaustion, and you now have a successful hunt. So we've got walking endurance, but depending on the distance you're talking about, we don't have the endurance of a horse. We don't have the endurance of a camel. So over and over, what you see, this theme with us is we're generalists. There's very few things we specialize in. We're not amazing at anything out there in terms of sensory systems or musculature. We can kind of get by with a whole bunch of different things we can do. And that's interesting to me because that runs counter to a lot of biases we've got in society. From what I know about how college application processes work with admissions offices, and who knows what has changed since the pandemic, but getting into an upper tier university, everyone who applies to it thinks they have to have been the president or vice president of 14 different clubs and play 8 musical instruments and be fluent in 4 different languages. And those are not the ones that the admissions offices at Ivy League schools look for. They want to find someone who's one of the world's experts on some bizarre thing they've been obsessed with since they were 6 years old, because they're going to do something interesting. Oh, specialists, we really value specialists. Generalists do a whole lot better in all sorts of realms. Wisdom of the crowd phenomenon. You take a bunch of people who are moderately good at figuring out the answer to a problem, and you have all of them come up with their estimates independently and average it out, and they're going to be more accurate than the most specialized specialist out there. All sorts of ways in which we've been pretty good going for the strategy of being generalist instead of putting all of our hominin eggs in one basket of expertise. And I think that's basically how we have come to dominate the world.
It's also what I think makes humans an impressive species. The way I always like to think about it is there's all sorts of athletes who win gold medal in a particular sport, but the person who gets proclaimed to be the best athlete in the world is the person who wins the decathlon. They're not the best in the world at any of the 10 categories, but they're sure the best at combining them all, and that's humans. Finally, Imogen from New Zealand asks, how did organisms go from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction, and what are the advantages throughout history?
Very awkwardly for the most part. Asexual reproduction, that's one done by most organisms on Earth throughout most of history. Asexual reproduction, here's a cell, and it makes 2 copies of its genes, and it splits in 2. And the daughter cell is genetically identical to the parent cell. You have a clone you have cloned, and that is asexual reproduction. And that's all anybody was doing until maybe 1 to 2 billion years ago. At which point, a subset of the living beasts on Earth invented sexual reproduction. Rather than making a copy of all your genes, you take half your genes and you combine them with half the genes of somebody else. Sexual reproduction. So where'd that come from? Obviously, nobody knows what happened the day it was invented, and there's theories out the wazoo, but you can get some insights into it by looking at some intermediate versions of the transition from asexual reproduction to the sexual reproduction we all know and love. An early step, an early version of this transition was something called parthenogenesis. And this is where an organism has both, in effect, female and male gametes in them, and they are able to combine the two in novel ways and reproduce all on their own. What you see there is the cells undergo this horrible process we all memorized in biology, meiosis. Each one of their reproductive cells dumps half the gene, half the chromosomes, and now gets one with single copies of all the genes, and they combine together and they get fertilized. They have self-fertilized parthenogenesis. What are the advantages of doing this? This is a way to get more variability in there, because not only are you making novel combinations, but you've got something called recombination crossovers, where bits of DNA on these two parts that are now coming together for the first time in history, they switch, they cross over. So it's a great way for getting more variability. And that's been the standard explanation for why there's been this transition from you just make a copy of your singular DNA to this weird parthenogenesis stuff where you got the machinery for both sexes in there and you activate them. When's particularly good to activate them? When you're solitary, when there's nobody else around because you can't find a mate. And there's a lot of species that do facultative parthenogenesis, which is to say, when there's other folks around, they do sex the usual way. But if there's nobody else around, they go and do parthenogenesis all on their own. Lizards, snails, Komodo dragons do this sort of thing. Then you have the next step in this process. And now you have what are termed hermaphrodites. And just like in the parthenogenic species, every individual comes with the female reproductive apparatus, if that's the word, and the male reproductive, and they don't bring the two together to do parthenogenesis. Instead, they find somebody else who's a hermaphrodite. And today I'm the female and you're the male, and tomorrow I'll be the male and this new individual is the female. And you are exchanging genes, you are recombining genes from individuals who are completely novel. So what are the upsides of this? Same deal again. This is a way of getting a whole lot more variety in there, because now you're combining half of the DNA per cell from this individual plus that one. And once they come together, they do some of that crossover recombination stuff. What's another advantage of it? One of the individuals carries a mutation, for example. And it's one of those mutations, what's termed a recessive mutation, where you've got to have the mutation on both genes, both versions of the genes on each of the pair of chromosomes. They've got the mutation, they've got the disease that's horrible, and they undergo meiosis, and it only is a single copy, and they recombine with somebody who doesn't have the mutation at all. What have you just done? You've just weeded out the mutation. This is a good way of keeping down rates of mutations in populations. Most of all, what you wind up getting is an ability to do a Hail Mary. There's some massive change in the environment, and you're all going to go extinct. And this is the time where the fact that you are mixing and matching genes with somebody else, maybe you're going to stumble into a combination where your kid is going to be one of the few to survive. Okay, so what are the downsides of being a hermaphrodite? First off, you've got a very distinctive disadvantage when you're dealing with asexual species like all those bacteria. A bacteria is all by itself, and it splits in two. And then they split in two. And you got four of them, and they go on and on. You can't start that doubling process with hermaphroditic species until you got two of them. The population increases at half the rate. Or framed another way, every time a bacteria reproduces, speaking of the devil, every time a bacteria reproduces asexually, it passes on 100% of its genes. Every time a hermaphroditic species reproduces, it only passes on 50% of its genes, half the rate of leaving copies in the next generation. So that's one of the drawbacks of ultimately you're using only half of your DNA. You and the one you combine with, your descendants, are going to be fruitful and multiplying at half the speed of asexual organisms that are just splitting, clonally reproducing themselves. There's another downside by the time you are having hermaphroditic reproduction, where you are getting the genes from two different individuals, complementary, and they then do this crossover and switching. When you're combining your genes with those of somebody else, you've got a vulnerability. And this is perfectly summarized in the immortal words of the evolutionary biologist Burt Bacharach. What do you get when you kiss a guy? You get enough germs to catch pneumonia. And after you do, he'll never phone you. Parasitism, infectious disease. As soon as you're mating, you have suddenly invented sexually transmitted diseases. So that's the problem there. Then finally, with all these intermediate forms, you get to us, you get to sexual reproduction, where rather than every individual coming with the plumbing for a female and the plumbing for a male, it's only one of the two. Each one has picked only one of the two. And from there, you get your meiotic cells with only one copy of each chromosome, and they come together and they recombine and you shuffle. The same advantages of increasing variation, the same advantages of being able to weed out some of these mutations, the same advantages of being able to come up with novel Hail Mary combinations under periods of extreme duress, environmental stress, and things of that sort. And what are the biggest reasons, though, that differentiates us sexually reproducing organisms from those hermaphroditic ones? Eggs are very specialized cells. In their own pathetic, overrated way, sperm are very specialized cells. Eggs are enormously costly in terms of they lead to the cost of pregnancy, and that's very challenging. Sperm are very costly because you're making a gazillion of them. When you suddenly only have the reproductive apparatus of one sex in you, in other words, like us, you can get a whole lot more specialized in that one that you have. You can devote energy solely to egg production and maturation. You can devote all of your energy solely to sperm production. Once you get to sexual reproduction, like us, you get the most viable, most fertile, most run faster and jump higher eggs and sperm out there. That's the big advantage we came up with over those hermaphrodites who only wish they could be like us and have sexual reproduction. So that's a sense asexual. You do it all on your own. You can double and quadruple and it grows a whole lot faster. And then all these intermediate forms eventually culminating in sexual reproduction. You grow at a slower rate. You pass on only 50% of your genes with each generation, but you get a whole lot more variability in your population. You have a whole lot greater likelihood that your offspring is going to have some novel gene combination that's going to turn out to be wonderful. You are going to get a whole lot more ways of stamping out mutations, all sorts of advantages. And if you do the human primate mammalian vertebrate version of it, for most vertebrates, you've got that extra advantage that you could get very specialized cells. All you got to make are eggs, or all you got to make are sperm. That seems to be the biggest advantage to it in the long run.
So my biggest takeaway is we may be generalists, but our sexual reproductive cells sure are not.
That's absolutely the case.
And that's it. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.